Well, hello, my name is Jason Kelly, and today I have Chuck Capps, our corn and grain sorghum verification coordinator, with us today. And we're out in our Lonoke County corn verification program on Bill I and Steele Fletcher, just west of Lonoke. And today, August the 24th, it's supposed to be what, Chuck, 100 degrees, or it feels like 100 already first thing this morning. So, we're just now getting started on corn harvest. I think we're about 9% harvested statewide, so we're really just now getting into harvest mode. And at this point in the year, we just kind of wanted to talk about really what we saw this year, maybe some things we can capitalize on for next year. To the whole goal is to keep increasing those corn yields and be more profitable at the end. So really today we're going to talk about 4 topics. We're going to talk about a little bit about getting corn planted right, the right hybrid, right population. A little bit about fertility. Fertilities are a big ticket item usually. And pest management, and then lastly get you to talk a little bit about irrigation. Irrigation is also a big thing. Statewide we're about 90% of our acres can be irrigated, so a lot of time and effort goes into irrigation for sure. So thinking more forward to next year, what can we do to increase our yields, have a success growing corn for next year? And to me, it always starts with you got to get corn planted properly. Corn is one of those crops that, it's got to start off right, or in the end you're probably going to be disappointed. I hear so often a thin soybean stand made a bumper crop, right? Well, how many times do we hear a thin corn crop made a bumper crop?
Nah,
we don't hear that.
Not very often.
Yeah, not very often. And so, planting date is very critical for corn. We've done a lot of planting date studies in the past, and it depends on where you are in the state. That mid-March to mid-April, end of April, kind of that 6-week period where we generally can maximize yield. And in that time frame, we want to plant to get the best stand. So in other words, we don't want to plant even though it's the 20th of March, which may be an ideal time for your area of the state. We don't want to plant ahead of a big rain. So, getting that optimum stand, perfect stand, is really what we need to have. And so, Chuck, the planting date out here is what?
April the 6th.
April 6th. So April 6th, Lonoke County, to me, that's really probably an ideal time. Most years that soil temperature is going to be warmed up enough that we get emergence fairly quickly. I think it come up, 8 days, 10 days this year?
8 to 9, something like that, yes.
Yeah, so we came up, got a good stand, vigorous stand, and, that's the first key, is getting it up out of the ground. Right. So plant population wise is also very critical. We've had some plant population trials this year, and in past years where 34,000 roughly is typically where we maximize our yields on most hybrids. There can be some differences in hybrids, and some of them can't stand that high population. Right. So Chuck, what's our hybrid out here, and what's our plant population?
We planted cropland 5550, and our final population was 35,800, right in that ballpark.
So 35,000, you think, well, that sounds like a lot of plants. 30-inch rows out here, that's really probably ideal, and that's what our data has shown in the past. Now, there are certain hybrids, some of the tall, full-season hybrids that 35,000 is probably too many plants. So, there are some differences in our county production meetings this fall and winter. We can go into a little more detail about what population fits what hybrid and all that. So we're also, for long we'll be picking out what hybrid to plant, getting our seed book for next year. And there's some things that we really need to look for, right, Chuck?
Correct.
Green snap, we had any green snap problems in the past?
Yes, had a lot this year.
Yeah. So the wind and flooding storms we had that first week in June, really, and we've got some good data we'll present later in the production meetings this winter, but there are some hybrids that have significant green snap problems. Adjacent hybrid, none at all. So picking out one that's going to stand the windstorm, may not get a windstorm every year, but I guess we can have insurance that may take care of that, may not. So just to try to avoid that, pick some hybrids that have good green snap tolerance. And like I say, this winter we'll have some hybrids to talk about there. You know, last year, about this time of year, 1st of September, we're always looking at the tropics, right? You know, seeing what hurricane or tropical storm is coming this way. And last year we had 2 of them come through. And so we had a lot of corn that blew down with those storms late in the season. And just like on green snap, we could see some that stood perfectly and some that really went down. So green snap tolerance, late season lodging, root lodging, we see some of that as well. So, you know, picking the right hybrid, even though, you know, price per bag is sometimes something people look at, but to me, we really need to be looking at the big picture. How's that hybrid going to yield, of course, but then green snap tolerance, root lodging, late season lodging, very important. So getting the crop off to a good start, can't overcome a thin stand, the wrong hybrid, though planted late, you know, those type of things. So fertility is our next biggest input, or in a lot of fields maybe our largest input. And so Chuck, out here in our Lone Oak County verification field we got behind us here, what was our fertility program this year?
Well, we ended up with 235 units of nitrogen total for the year, 50 units, around 50 units up front in planting, then the larger shot there at the kind of that mid-season, that V6 type stage. And then we finished up with another 46 units pre-tassel. We had some sulfur we applied, having sandy ground out here, through ammonium sulfate, but we didn't need to apply any phosphorus, potassium, or zinc because they were all optimum by our soil samples, and we went by our soil samples, so we didn't need to apply any other besides nitrogen and sulfur.
So the nitrogen, you say we put out roughly 50 units of nitrogen pre-plant, and so, you know, we hear people say, well, that's not hardly anything. You know, we're used to planting, putting 80 or 100 or 120 units out at planting, which, you know, that's typically maybe what we did several years ago. But you know, we've got more data, have a better understanding about nitrogen management now. So, you know, especially during wet years like this past year, if you put out 100 units at planting, you know, it's going to take that plant 4 or 5 weeks or more to be able to pick up that nitrogen. Well, in the meantime, we get 5 inches of rain, 10 inches of rain. You know, we're going to lose some of that nitrogen. And of course, this year with all the rain we had, we definitely lost some nitrogen. And so, you know, one of the things that I think many people are doing, and I think in wet years, and especially like this year when we got so much rain in early June, you know, putting that extra pre-tassel nitrogen, not necessarily extra, but a planned pre-tassel out there. So we still only put 230 units to 235 units out here, but we spread it over 3 applications. And this year, I think that really is going to pay off because, you know, early June, first 10 days of June, we got about 10 inches of rainfall.
Yes.
And so if we had already put all of our nitrogen out there, guess what? Probably at the end, we would have been running out. And so if you drive around the state, I see a lot of fields that, not knowing how much nitrogen they put out there, but there's a lot of fields that visually ran out of nitrogen.
Correct.
So spreading that nitrogen out over 2-3 applications is the thing to do. So if we cut back to 50 pounds of nitrogen at planting, well, you know, that I know one of the problems is, or limitations is, well, I've got to put that much more nitrogen out on my side dress, right? Instead of 300 pounds of urea, maybe I need 450 or 500, you know, depending on what you're doing, but a lot of volume of fertilizer. And so when we cut back on that nitrogen up front, I really feel like we can get in a situation where we need 2 side dress applications.
Correct.
So have we done any of that, or we're still able to do, you know, 1 application, or we got any instances where we're doing 2 applications?
We've done 2 side dress applications, yes, yeah. We have. We're really, really fit, you know, maybe ahead of a large rain we knew, wasn't sure, but looking at splitting those applications to make sure we didn't run out of nitrogen.
And I think that's the key. I mean, in our environment, we're hedging against nitrogen loss. So, you know, basically we don't want to run out the end. And so tell us a little bit about, you know, we follow our recommendations in the verification program. So how do we know we had adequate NPK, sulfur, zinc out here mid-season? So, you know, when we still had time to put out some more fertilizer, how do we determine whether we were okay on fertility?
We came out about the V10, V11 stage and pulled ear leaf samples. Once we were able to get that full ear leaf, we went out and sampled those, and I think it was 10 different spots in the field, pulled 5 different leaves in those spots and had the field analyzed. We were fortunate we were able to just kind of pull this field as one sample. It's very uniform in soil type, so we sent that in and it came back that all of our nutrients were good, but it was leaning towards we need to apply more nitrogen, like for the pre-tassel. So
Yeah, and I think that's one thing this year that a lot of people are getting, so they do take tissue samples, and I think that takes some of the guesswork out. Anything we can have a definitive way of going about it instead of guessing, I think is a good thing. So looking at those tissue samples, if we had 3% nitrogen or greater in those ear leaves, V10 up to tassel, if we had at least 3%, we were probably okay. And that's
right.
what our research has shown in the past. So we had 230 units roughly out here. So, depending on soil type, we may put more or less even. So, end of the season, how do we know whether we had enough? Yield's going to tell us a lot of things, but is there anything else we can do to tissue samples that would show us whether we had adequate nitrogen?
yes, we take stalk samples. We've got to go out to the field, approximately the same kind of GPS location, similar to where we took the leaf samples from earlier, and we take a stalk sample from the bottom portion of the plant with some cutters that we have, which is right here. Take a bottom portion of the plant. This is placed on the ground. It takes that particular portion of the plant. We send those samples in to Trent Roberts up at Fayetteville at our lab, and it sends it back to us. It tells us basically 3 things. Was nitrogen a limiting factor? Did we run out? Was it adequate, or did we have too much? And if we staying in the same cropping system year after year, it will give these guys a sense, of these growers, a sense of if their nitrogen program's working or not,
Yeah.
or if they're not putting out enough, putting out too much. And we send that in like the previous 4 years cropping system with that, so we can kind of help them manage their nitrogen better.
And I know just about all the samples we take, they come back where we feel like we're in that zone where we need to be on fertility. So
Correct.
Okay, great. What about pest management? I drive around this time of year and I see a lot of cornfields that really look pretty clean. If you look down the row, there's not many weeds at all, and if you look down the row in this field behind us here, very weed free. And it may be a field that doesn't have a lot of weed pressure to begin with. But what's our typical herbicide program that we would use in a verification?
Typical, we would run a pre-emerge herbicide with multiple modes of action in it, maybe along with the glyphosate, something like that, and then we would come back at that V4 type timing, kind of a lay-by type application with Halex GT, something like that, along with glyphosate and atrazine to get multiple modes of action. This field stayed a little bit cleaner. We had to break from that a little bit in that we ran Roundup and Dual early, right behind the Hipper roller and right behind planting, and then we ran a pint of Dual, a quart of glyphosate, and then we ran 2 quarts of atrazine because the Fletchers some years have green beans in the rotation, so there was a lot of chemistry that's in some of the corn herbicides that limited us, so we weren't able to apply those on this particular field, but it still stayed clean all year.
I was going to say, but just a basic program, Dual, glyphosate, atrazine, which used to be a standard program, but if you go out here and look, it's still pretty clean.
It's
so,
clean.
Timing's everything. For late season weed control, we really wanted to lay that 2 pounds of atrazine as long as we can, which would be typically V5, or at least by the time it's 12 inches tall. So,
Correct.
Another thing we had out here, a lot of people dealt with, was southern rust this year, and we were no exception. A lot of rainfall early June, May, June. Early July, and so it always seems like we get a lot of rainfall, we get the right conditions, southern rust blows in, then all of a sudden we got southern rust. So, typically in the past, if we planted early, say at least in this area right here, first part of April, a lot of times we would outrun the southern rust. So in other words, the corn would be made really before it really got active. Well, this year, not so much, right?
Correct.
So early July, corn was at R2 stage. We found southern rust.
Yes.
So, if you think at that stage we got 4 or 5 weeks at least before we were to maturity. So really that was a no-brainer. We needed to treat that field. It was pretty active, and we see a lot of that statewide. And you know, the timing generally, if you can wait till we get to silking, that's going to give you almost season-long protection. So we were R2. I don't know if we got season-long control, but I think we got enough control that we're not going to have any issues.
Yes, we carried it out far enough.
Yeah.
Yes.
So a lot of corn was sprayed with foliar fungicides this year, and when it come in, I think it probably made sense. So.
Yeah.
Next would be irrigation. So Chuck, statewide, we're able to irrigate about 90% of our acres, which is, you know, nationwide, we're probably as high as anybody. This year we probably have a little bit more dry land, which, you know, a few areas we got some dry land corn. Rains have probably come pretty nice for that. So out here behind us with good silt loam soil, excellent drainage. You know, what's one of the problems with one of these type soils that has really good drainage, dries out really quick? How do we time our irrigations?
Well, it is kind of difficult with it's got a little bit more sand in it than typical silt loam, so it dries out a little bit quicker. But we've been able to implement a program working with Chris Henry. He's helped us with the soil moisture sensors and the telemetry units to be able to help us time the irrigations. We come out early in the season. We install the soil moisture sensors. This is just a 30-inch sensor, but we'll put 4 of those in the field very early once we have a stand establishment at 6, 12, 18, and 30 inches. We hook these into the telemetry units, which we put these out just a hair later once we get all the implements across the field, which, you know, after that last spray and fertilizer there, we put these out, plug them in, and it gives us a reading. These are connected to the AgSense app, and we get a reading from those, updates multiple times a day. We plug those into the AR Soil Calc app, and it just lets us know how the field, what the moisture is in the soil to help us predict when we need to irrigate by putting all that in. And it's been a tremendous help in our program, and we've been able to cut back a lot of irrigations due to this by knowing what's going on in the soil and not just going off a calendar.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. I mean, there's so many guess on sometimes, but be able to have a soil moisture sensor there in the soil at different depths to say, well, we got deep moisture, we're going to be okay, especially at the end of the season. We're trying to decide whether to cut off irrigation. We got deep moisture still, or we got moisture, you know, down in the profile. You know, maybe we could shut it off maybe a little bit earlier than sometimes we think, or in some instances we may want to water another one, but it helps take some of the guesswork out. So, you know, shout out to Chris Henry's crew. I know he did a lot of work getting us set up there, so that's very appreciative. So today, talked a little bit about some topics going into next. A lot of things going into making successful corn. Got to have a little cooperation with the weather, right? That's something I wish we could control a little better, but we can. But getting it planted right, taking care of our fertility needs, weeds, foliar diseases, and of course irrigation. So that was just in a nutshell some things that help us have a successful crop next year. We can go more in depth at our county production meetings this winter, but thank you for viewing today, and be happy to answer any questions at another time.